BBC4 Collections, specially chosen programmes from the BBC archive.
I've seen thousands of autopsies and dead bodies in crime scenes, and never in my career have I seen anything like what this murderer did to Mary Kelly. It was the most degrading, frenzied, hateful act that is imaginable. Mary Kelly was pretty, and I think the sexual allurement really set him off. Probably the next thing he did was slit open her belly. Then he began, of course, having fun with her body. You know, dismembering, cutting off her breasts and her right leg. He took off her entire face, basically flayed her to the bone. There's no statute of limitation on homicide, and just because these cases happened 114 years ago, the victims have a right to justice. Mary Kelly has a right for the world to know who murdered her, and that is my mission, is to bring about this justice in the only way I know how, which is to identify the person who did it. I believe we owe it to society and to the victims to pursue the Ripper cases. And that takes lay people like me, because Scotland Yard, well, they've got active cases to investigate, are certainly not going to investigate a 112-year-old case for which there will be no prosecution and which would cost a lot of money. I became interested in Jack the Ripper very accidentally. I was asked if I wanted to go to Scotland Yard, and I'd never been to Scotland Yard. And one of my methods in my books is I always try to cover a branch of law enforcement that I have never exposed myself to, and Scotland Yard was one of those. So I went over and I met John Grieve. And I was told that, by the way, he's a Ripper expert. And so he offered to take me on a retrospective visit of the crime scenes.
A lot of people are surprised to discover that the 5 murders about which we know most cover only a 4-month period during the autumn of 1888. So those 5 definitely escalate in terms of the injuries inflicted up to the horrendous murder of Mary Jeanette Kelly.
Marianne Nichols, what happened to her?
She's the first of the 5 that we know most about. And she's found in the early hours of the morning. They don't notice that she's got cuts to her abdomen. In fact, they don't do any real examination of the body until they get it to the mortuary. And that's the first of the series. Where we are here is the second one, which is Annie Chapman's murder is only 9 days after Podnick's. And at that stage, they link, the police link the two murders to each other because Annie Chapman's got severe cuts to her abdomen. She got part of her intestines dragged out. Annie Chapman's injuries are more severe. There is more mutilation. Okay, so this is the scene of the two murders on the night of the 30th of September into the 1st of October. The first one is Liz Stride, and she's found with a throat cut. 45 minutes later, you get the murder victim found here. And Catherine Eddowes, who's found here, is severely mutilated and dismembered. So the risks he's running are absolutely enormous to do two on one night. The first thing about Mary Jeanette Kelly is she's murdered in her own home. You know, the place where you should be safest is where she's murdered. And her body literally festooned around the room. The other thing about this is it's very early days of crime scene photography, so we have some crime scene photographs.
These poor women seemed to be screaming out for help from beyond the grave. Suddenly, this was more than research for one of my novels. This was a criminal investigation. This was my crusade. Dreadful stories, you know, the stamp collectors are in town. There's the World Championship backgammon tournament. They've got a new air compressor. That was my favorite. So they would throw me these dreadful stories, and I'd scurry off, and I'd do them, and I was putting in 100 hours overtime a month. And so within 6 months, they made me a full-time reporter. And then very, very soon after that, they threw me into the police beat. I had absolutely no interest in the police beat. I had never been interested in crime, yet what I didn't know is that I had an entire circuit board that was inside of me that was just waiting for that to be plugged in. And the first exposure I had to that police beat, it's like this whole new side of me just lit up.
Hey, Corinne, I got an order for you. Overturned vehicle on Inflake with 2 traffic.
Go, girl. I don't see things the same way other people do. Someone will see something as a stereotype, and I look at it, and I'd be very moved and sometimes startled by a detail.
I had to say, where's the pool pass? Oh, yeah.
I wanted to go behind the tape, and I wanted to go in that refrigerator, and I wanted to go in that autopsy room. And that was forbidden, verboten. Reporters don't go there.
All right, well, we're working on this skeletal remains. We still don't have an identity.
I needed to go visit a medical examiner, and so I got an interview at the chief medical examiner's office in Richmond, and the first person I ever talked to was Dr. Marcella Fierro.
At the time, we needed a technical writer, so we hired her because she was literate, very literate. And so she came and edited and helped write the Medical Legal Bulletin, which was a publication we put out 4 times a year. The group in the back here are folks that were doing... She bugged everybody. Patsy has this insatiable thirst for knowledge, and it's not restricted to a discipline.
We just don't know who they are.
Current cases are pretty much out. We just have 2 left over.
So she always asked questions. So I think she developed a good feel for the ambiance of a medical examiner's office.
Well, what I was hoping you would do is I want to show you these, what scant few photographs from the Jack the Ripper, the 5 or the ones that are best known. And this is Mary Kelly. It's the only crime scene photographs.
It's a very disturbing scene. There's so much violence. The degree of mutilation here is excessive. It's way beyond anything you'd need ever to kill anybody or torture anybody. It's
To me, it sends a message of there's something else operating here. The purpose here is simply not to kill somebody. It's to degrade them and to provide a spectacle for whoever finds them to be shocked, which they surely would be. The pose of the body, and it is posed, reflects some sexual interest.
With the legs splayed like that.
And with the intestines laying on a table, you have to ask yourself, why would anybody even bother to cut out somebody's intestines? I mean, it's not considered erotic. And the damage to the face is very disturbing because it reflects a great deal of emotion.
Have you seen cases where there's facial mutilation where the killer really did not know the person?
Yes, and those are cases where their hatred towards women is so powerful, they don't even want to deal with the idea of looking at a face. They just have to depersonalize them and degrade them as much as they can.
And you would have caught him if you'd been there.
Well, I don't know. I think the sort of case would be very intensely investigated by everybody.
If you go in there to try to see what the doctors are seeing, it changes everything. You're seeing it as reading the hieroglyphics of a person who can no longer speak so that you can understand how they lived and how they died and maybe why they died and who did it. But it took me years before I had the courage to write about what I was seeing. A day never went by when a memory wasn't triggered, when an image didn't flash. I would see a face ruined by injury and death, a body in bondage. I would see suffering and annihilation in unbearable detail, for nothing was hidden from me. I knew the victims too well. I cannot count the violent deaths I have seen since my career began. You know, people are desensitized to violence. They really are. Jack the Ripper's a perfect example of being desensitized to violence, and so I decided, you know what? I'm going to write about violence, and I'm going to show you violence. I'm going to make you see it and feel it and understand the pain of it and the horror of it. More than a century has passed since the Ripper murders, and the theories haven't stopped. I wanted to work the case as it should be, as a criminal investigation, and the only way to find the truth was to excavate and reconstruct. This is what forensic experts do.
I was very curious about Catherine Eddowes. She was the only victim that was described where the Ripper cut through all of her clothing. And I'm going to cut open a little bit here, and this is going to gross out everybody. I'll stick a little bit of softer tissue in here. And we'll put something yucky in here like this. Okay, now what we're gonna do is, she had on about 6 layers of clothing, so this is what I really wanna see. And all of these are natural fibers because they did not use synthetics back then. Look at this. This is what shocked me. Jagged cut 6.5 inches long from waistband. You have a jagged cut 10.5 inches long. This is all through clothing. If this person cut through clothing, as opposed to ripping through it, again, you're dealing with the emotion of a crime scene.
I always think of Scarpetta as being an amalgam or a combination of many persons. The work that I do, some of the things that I say, but she certainly doesn't look like me. I mean, Scarpetta's 5'2", blonde and blue-eyed, weighs 105 pounds. You know, I haven't seen that since I was 12.
Now, one thing I want to show that's important is what kind of knife was used. Straight razors. This was a common weapon that was used with your lower economic status East Enders. I mean, you'd have to hold this thing really hard, and chances are it's going to fold back on you, and you're going to really hurt yourself. Razors were mentioned, but this is not what was used in these murders. Okay, to cut to the chase here, it's more likely there was a stabbing, and then he would cut through this, and what he did was he tore. In his frenzy, in particular, he tore this stuff. That he didn't sit there and cut through it.
Her creative imagination is something to be looked for in detectives, you know. You don't want them all imagining everything, but you have to you have to imagine yourself back at the crime scene and think about where you're going with this evidence.
2 of the Ripper murders, the intestines and so forth were thrown over the shoulders. Gross, okay, but this is what he did. And there was a suspicion that there was some symbolism in this. There's no symbolism here. Pitch dark, it's not hard to get, you can pull these entrails out, you might cut them off, and up here you have the person's right shoulder, left shoulder, and I think what he did is, see, she's bleeding up here at the neck, so he's gonna come around here, and when he pulls this stuff out, he's just throwing it. He's not doing something symbolic. You're throwing it over there. Why? Because she's spurting blood out of her neck. He's getting it out of his way, and then you reach in and you can feel a kidney. We all know what they look like. In fact, the English eat kidneys. And then you're taken off. You're running, you're gone. This required no anatomical skill whatsoever. This is just, it's slash and grab. That's what it was.
Her work reflects accurately what medical examiners and forensic scientists do. I think exclusively, practically always, you can take what she says to the bank.
I never really had any concept of who Jack the Ripper was, but as I began to study his crimes, I formulated very quickly that this was somebody who was an organized killer, who premeditated what he was doing, knew how to strike and knew how to get away. I didn't have much of a thought about who this person was, so I started saying, well, who are the suspects?
The main suspects in the Jack the Ripper case for a long time were Montague Druitt, Kosminski, and Michael Ostrog. Others in more recent years have been Dr. Francis Tumblety, 55 years old, an American doctor. The Duke of Clarence as Jack the Ripper is a very popular one. Sir William Gull, the royal physician. Names are thrown into the pot, and the most ridiculous stories are concocted around them, and this is the problem as far as Ripper research is concerned.
For me, these suspects are based on theory, not evidence. But in the wings was a shadowy figure, never a suspect until mere decades ago. He was Walter Sickert, the painter. I wanted to re-examine the evidence and apply to this age-old case modern investigative police methods.
People have talked about Walter Sickert since almost the time of the murder, to such an extent that the catalogue of a recent exhibition about him saw it necessary to dismiss the suggestion that he was Jack the Ripper, but in considerable detail, which is not something you normally find in an exhibition catalogue.
It was simply several weeks after I went on the tour with John Grieve that I became locked onto Sickert. He was like pulsing on my radar screen, and that was based on his paintings. I visually connect things. I'm a very, very visual person. This is a photograph of Catherine Eddowes taken in the mortuary, and I was looking through a Sickert art book, and I came across this painting called Le Journal. And the first thing that struck me about it is what a strange painting, what a strange posture for this woman to be in. She's way thrown back. I mean, who reads a newspaper way up here? She's leaning over the back of a couch. And also, this choker of pearls around her neck is very atypical for anything I've seen in any other Sickert paintings. And what it struck me is like a negative of beads of blood, like symbolic of that. And then there's a Ripper letter, which later on says, "Did you like the pretty necklace I gave her?" And in those days, when they referred to a cut throat sometimes as a necklace. And then I went back and looked at this photograph because it reminded me of that, and I thought the similarity between the two was really frightening. I knew I was going to set myself up to be shredded by people, critics, all those people who've studied Jack the Ripper all their lives, people who worship Walter Sickert, but the more you know about him, the more you can see that he would be a perfect suspect or individual to have committed these crimes and have gotten away with them. I found out that he was born in Germany and came to London as a little boy for an operation in 1865. As a young adult, he worked first as an actor and then as an assistant to the American painter Whistler. Once independent, he became infamous for his intense and vibrant depictions of low-life music hall scenes, and later, a series of nudes in seedy bed-sitting rooms, which to me are both chilling and terrifying, with women who look dead. He was a restless and volatile man with numerous addresses in secret studios. He moved with consummate ease from bohemian salons to the drawing rooms of the British establishment.
Sickert was a remarkable individual, an extraordinarily larger-than-life character. And because of that, the many people who knew him, even in his lifetime, particularly towards the end of his life, recorded his astonishingly witty and amusing conversation, his personal eccentricities, also sometimes the rather unattractive sides of his character. He was outstanding in a rather drab era.
But I think he left us subtle clues in his paintings, and that if we look and look again, we can see into his Jekyll and Hyde character.
This is one of the most important pictures by Sickert that we have. This is ennui, boredom.
A lot of people can relate to that, I'm sure. Let me ask you something. How far away did Sickert stand from a canvas when he painted? Because I'm trying to see what he saw.
I mean, I think with something on this scale, it would be a mixture of working close up and then having to step back to see the more general effects.
Right.
I think the main point of this painting is about the relationship between the two figures, about the man and his wife.
Oh, absolutely.
And it's about people who have nothing left to say to each other. She's so bored. She's staring at the stuffed birds.
I mean, you've got this magnificent artistic talent. You can feel the tension there, the boredom, and I mean, there's an energy there, a bad energy between this couple. I mean, I can feel that, but then yet there's this thing up here, just something that I noticed that stopped me in my tracks. There's this strange, pale sort of crescent that's coming out over her left shoulder from what looks like the darkness, and if you stand back, and again you say, is this my imagination? To me, it looks like it could be almost a figure coming behind her.
I must say, looking at that, I can see what you mean, but it doesn't really look like that to me. It looks to me like a reflection or a shadow.
I'm not saying that's what it is, because it's like interpreting an ink blot. The other thing I noticed is this bottle of what looks like it'd be claret or something. Unless someone had just poured it, the way it's sort of trailing down the glass here, to me, who's an aficionado of crime as opposed to art, it has a sort of bloody, bleeding sort of look.
This is Sickert in the 1920s, and this is called The Servant of Abraham. It's a self-portrait. And again, as so often with his pictures, it's in character. It's a self-portrait, but he's actually adopting the persona of a biblical character.
Which is interesting.
There's actually no other evidence for him being the servant.
So why do you think he called it that?
Other than the title. I think Sickert is fascinated by ambiguity and the nature of our perception of what we think we're seeing and how he can play with that.
The more I investigated, the more I believed there was something truly bizarre about Sickert. When I visited my old friend, Ed Sulzbach, who worked for many years as a psychological profiler for the FBI, we reviewed the personality traits of a violent psychopath.
They can be extremely intelligent, some of them extraordinarily intelligent. Also articulate. They have good command of the language. They're extraordinarily manipulative. They can hit your buttons faster than you can believe. Their hallmark is no conscience. They can do anything as grotesque as putting a woman's bowels on her night table. And you or I would look at this and say, my God, what kind of person would do this? They'll do it. And they have a extremely large ego. They view themselves as some sort of Superman. They're convinced they're smarter than everybody else. And they love to prove it. They love to rub your nose in it and so on. This psychopathic personality generally flowers somewhere between the mid-20s to late 40s, early 50s. What you want to find in order to tie the murders together is signature stuff. That's the stuff that appeals to his innermost being.
What would be Jack the Ripper's signature?
The wound to the throat, the throttling of the victim, the evisceration, this interest in what's inside a woman, let's say. One of the things I would look for is for this killer to certainly not have stopped at 5. These guys will keep going until they're caught or killed or put away for something else.
As I continued to study his paintings and investigate the Ripper case, I became convinced that Mary Kelly was not his last victim. There were other murders in London and elsewhere which shared horrific similarities with the Ripper crimes, but the police never attributed them to him. It seemed to me as if people were determined to believe this serial killer had vanished. I looked at one particular murder of a prostitute in Camden Town, very close to Sickert's lodgings, and found the similarities frightening. And then I was shown a series of paintings by Walter Sickert chronicling this very murder. This image, actually called the Camden Town murder, depicts a lifeless woman on a bed. Her face is turned to a wall, and one can only imagine what has just happened. In another powerful and moving painting, a man contemplates a writhing naked woman on a bed. In yet another, a woman appears prone and defenseless from the predatory male staring at her. I believe Sickert committed the Camden Town murder and then used it as an excuse to depict a series of violent and pornographic pictures that relate not only to this victim, but to all of his killings.
He never, it seems to me, actually pins down in any single picture he painted a narrative or a story. It is all suggestion. So that when he comes to paint a picture called The Camden Town Murder of a woman on a bed with a man standing over her, one of his most famous, a very small painting, a very intense painting, with absolutely beautiful color in it, rather low in key, but lovely blues and grays and so on. I don't know whether the woman is cowering from the man or telling him she hasn't got the 10 bob for the rent.
It's not coincidental that it was reported in the Daily Telegraph that he told a reporter that after the Camden Town murder, he appeared at Emily Dimmock's house while the police were there and asked if he could come in and sketch the crime scene and the body. I think Sickert's reliving some of his violent crimes was through his paintings. What I needed to do now was to link the only surviving evidence from the case, the Ripper letters, with letters and memorabilia from Walter Sickert. I brought a team of experts to London and we examined the evidence.
received a phone call from Patricia, and she was excited about this investigation that she was conducting into the Jack the Ripper murders. I was a little bit taken aback at the time because I thought, holy cow, you know, this is a bit much to chew off. Now, I told her at that first conversation, I said, well, everything's going to be a long shot, but if we're lucky, DNA from saliva or from fingers would be on the Ripper letters and match those on the Walter Sickert letters, then you have a basis to be able to sustain that particular premise that the Walter Sickert was in fact Jack the Ripper. What we've done is we've actually delaminated this particular letter, and using nothing more than a sterile swab and type 1 sterile water, I'm simply going to take this, and then we have this little area right here, and I only need a few cells to have enough material to bring back to Richmond, and we'll amplify it and see if we can develop a DNA profile.
Amazingly, some of Sickert's clothes are stored at the Tate Gallery archives in London, and we were allowed to examine them too. DNA tests took weeks, and I was very anxious to hear the results. Unfortunately, Dr. Ferrara had bad news. There was no nuclear DNA detected on any of the documents we had tested. The lamination of the letters had degraded any DNA trace.
I was crushed, and Patricia was disappointed, but she said, well, all right, well, let's go on from here. What else can we do?
Well, you know, I don't know exactly what they had in commercial paints back then, but it's not like today. Meanwhile, I was buying paintings hoping to find fingerprints. We examined this one, which shows a rather drab landscape with a dreary winding path under a leaden gray English sky. Not by any means one of Sickert's greatest works.
No luck. No fingerprints were developed on that frame, and all we succeeded in doing was dismounting a perfectly good painting.
This was all very disappointing, but there was worse to come.
Cornwell took some of the paintings she bought at thousands of dollars a pop, and in a sense gave them forensic autopsies too.
That's where this whole rumor started that I, quote, mutilated a painting, which I absolutely did not do. I bought it from a private art dealer. He did not package it properly, and when it arrived, they all had heart attacks because there was a hole punched right in the middle of it. It desperately needs restoration, and it will get it. I am going to have it restored in London. Now, if there'd been something in that painting that would have been really incriminating and important, I may have cut a hole in it, but it had to be really important.
From my standpoint, I thought, you know, the one unique thing we were doing fell through.
Although the nuclear DNA showed no results and we had been unable to discover a fingerprint on a painting, we could test for mitochondrial DNA. It is not as conclusive as nuclear DNA, but in a modern criminal case, mitochondrial DNA can be a decisive factor in proving guilt. In nuclear DNA, the chances of a match between two different sources can be 1 in billions. With mitochondrial DNA, that statistic is vastly reduced,
the testing extremely time-consuming and costly.
Patricia is like a bulldog. When she gets her teeth into a concept, an idea, she's not one to let loose easily.
I think I'm driven. I think that some of what comes across as my fierceness and anger is really born of a tremendous sadness and oversensitivity and things that are residual from very early experiences. My father left the family when I was 5, but what he did that was really cruel is he left on Christmas morning. I just remember I started just screaming, and it was and I ran over and I grabbed him around the legs as he was getting to the front door, and I was screaming, "Daddy, don't leave, Daddy, don't leave." And he just shook me off his leg like I was a tree frog or something, and he went out the door. And he never really had much to do with us after that. I guess I felt so victimized as a child and so humiliated and powerless because of being left by my father, having big financial stresses in the family life. My mother had way too much stress on her that she couldn't manage sometimes, and then we ended up staying with people. I think that I am a poster child for what the average victim feels like. I was sexually assaulted when I worked at the Charlotte Observer. I don't want to say by who because there was never a court case. But when a woman was raped, the police would say, "Did you have an orgasm?" Can you imagine that?
Behave yourself.
I think one of the reasons I have so much compassion for victims is because I know what it feels like to be one. In my case, part of the way I fight back is through my work and in defending those people who can't defend themselves, even if they're dead. In my search for possible motives, I consulted historians and doctors and one of my team, the eminent New York sex crimes attorney, Linda Fairstein.
In many, many cases with serial sex offenders, these crimes occur in large measure because there is a sexual dysfunction. And often a sexual act can't be completed, but sometimes that's why the killing occurs. That's why there is the violence.
I would say if there was any one thing that pushed Walter Sickert over the edge, it is with the deformity he was born with, which is this fistula, a deformity of his penis, which required 3 surgeries on this little boy that would have been absolutely mutilating. Basically what the fistula is the urethra does not go all the way to the tip of the penis, and it forms another hole for the person to urinate out of, and there's no way to make that urethra longer. And so they'll cut back the penis until they get to the point where the person can urinate. If Walter was a lucky little boy, his ordeal began by his feeling suffocated as his nose and mouth were covered with a chloroform-soaked rag that was guaranteed to make him violently nauseated later. If he was an unlucky little fellow, he was wide awake and experienced every horror happening to him. The nurse may have firmly held his legs in place while Dr. Cooper took a scalpel and cut along the fistula's entire track according to the hospital's standard procedure. It could have resulted in the worst of all problems, which would have been a partial or almost complete amputation that would have required, number one, that he urinated like a woman, that he had to squat, and that 2, he could not have sex, and 3, the humiliation of it. So I think he had a tremendous rage about the loss of his manhood.
Most people forget that in homicide cases, most of the time, all we have as police and prosecutors is circumstantial evidence. It's valid in a courtroom. You don't have the luxury, I hate to call it, of surviving victims.
The Ripper thrived on taunting the police with his mocking letters and drawings. So I spent months examining the letters with my team. We focused on handwriting, and Veda Hart, the former Sickert archivist, brought our attention to something significant.
When I first came into the Public Record Office and looked at the Jack the Ripper letters, I was very disconcerted because so many of them seemed to be in different writing styles. And I thought, these can't possibly, there's no way that they could possibly be by one person. Looking at them more closely, I began to notice consistencies. There are consistencies about the mocking tone. There are consistencies in the way that they were sent. There are other things that strike me. Look at that, the way that Boss is written on that.
Hugely thick nib or whatever.
That has to be written with a very thick nib, but then the writing below is much thinner. Whoever this was using two different writing instruments, and you'll find that through many of the letters, that they're using perhaps a brush, perhaps a thick pen, perhaps a pencil that's been sharpened to a chisel end. Who would do that? It has to be an artist.
Sickert was an artist, but in his younger days, he had also been an actor. A telegram signed Jack the Ripper and sent to the police had a provocative link to Sickert's life on the stage. This telegraph made me nuts when I first saw it. What's interesting is that he started out writing something right here. What does it look like to you?
Mr. Nobody?
Exactly. That's what I thought too. And that is tremendously important because Sickert's stage name was Mr. Nemo. When he was an actor, Mr. Nemo, Latin for Mr. Nobody. So he started out writing something right here, crossed it out, and then wrote Jack the Ripper sent these.
The fact that Sickert used the name Nemo doesn't impress me. It's a stage name. He was an actor for 3 years. He also changes his name for Walter to Richard so he can actually sign messages Dick Sick.
He played with different ideas, different roles, different identities throughout his life. So Mr. Nobody, in a sense, would suggest that his sense of identity was a great problem to him.
Dr. Ferrara returned to Virginia to continue more detailed comparisons between Ripper and Sickert letters, and there he found another clue.
This letter is one of the more recently found Jack the Ripper letters that we were particularly interested in. One of the things we noted was this partial watermark that you see here in the photo. When I was looking at Walter Sickert's correspondence, this particular letter of his, I saw that in fact there was a full watermark, the A. Peary and Sons. Now, do they overlay each other?
It fits.
I think it's reasonable to assume that a lot of people use that particular stationery. So this is not a smoking gun by any stretch of the imagination, but at least we were able to establish a tenuous link or commonality between at least one of the Jack the Ripper letters, and subsequently some others, and Walter Sickert.
Then I received an unexpected phone call, one of those magic moments in a criminal investigation. A woman in Cornwall, in southern England, had heard I was working on the Ripper case, and she showed me a visitor's book from a guest house popular with artists at the end of the 19th century. The book was full of comments and drawings from the various guests over the years. What I found myself looking at, it literally sent a chill up my spine. I mean, my hair practically stood on end when I saw that Jack the Ripper signature. I mean, it was like an amazing moment. These drawings right here, I was wondering what you would make. These are photographs of of pages from a Ripper letter.
Yes.
Called the Pearly King. See how the pipe has been drawn in this character's mouth? And this is from, quote, Jack the Ripper at the Public Records Office.
Yes.
And you look at these characters on this page. Again, I'm not the art person, but if you look, I was just wondering how they would compare to this Ripper letter.
They're very similar. The first thing that struck me was that these drawings were almost certainly by the same hand as the person that made the drawings in the Ripper letters in the Public Record Office.
In these drawings right here, I was wondering what you would make, because this to me, that when I first saw it, I immediately thought that looks to me like a caricature of Whistler.
I completely agree. I mean, it looks exactly like Whistler. We know that Whistler went down to Cornwall in 1883-4 along with Sickert, so to see his image here is very interesting.
There is a place in here where it looks like Sickert might have written his initials with the date October 1889. It's right in the margin, sort of a cipher or monogram. It's sort of a W with an R on top and an S, and then October 1889. This case has worn me to the bone. I don't know of anything I've ever done that's made me as tired. And I'll honestly tell you, I have not had a life at all. It's been a tremendous financial expense that I would never have chosen. I mean, I've spent about $6 million on this book. It's like raising part of the Titanic. Months had passed since Dr. Ferrara had started the mitochondrial DNA testing. At last, we had the results. Genetic locations in a sequence found in mitochondrial DNA from a Ripper letter were also found in mitochondrial DNA from 2 Sickert letters. The evidence added yet another incriminating layer to the case.
It's not definitive at this point. It's iffy. But it's tantalizingly iffy again in terms of we can't eliminate Walter Sickert.
I thought I understood what it was like to be a police investigator, and I had no clue, because I've been put in the role of being a Dr. Scarpetta, being a police detective, being a medical examiner, where I can't manufacture the evidence. I'm dependent on what really happened, what really is found, and I had no idea how agonizing that is.
Like the best detectives I've ever worked with, she never lets go. She just goes on and on and on, and she'll get to the bottom of it. And I think she's taken the Jack the Ripper case further than I've seen anybody else take it.
And then came maybe the greatest breakthrough in the investigation when I received a letter from the Manchester City Art Gallery in the UK.
Dear Patricia Cornwall, I was very interested to read in the British National Press about your fascinating research into the alleged connection between Jack the Ripper and W.R. Sickert. We have a painting in our collections by Sickert called Jack the Ripper's Bedroom. I do not exaggerate when I say that the atmosphere is so heavy one could cut it with a knife.
I was shocked. I wondered whether it was really possible that a painting by Walter Sickert called Jack the Ripper's Bedroom could have been forgotten about. But when I called around, I found that it did not appear in any of the Sickert catalogs and seemed unknown to the art historical establishment. Was this the final tease? Sickert actually telling the world that he was Jack the Ripper?
The title is remarkable in itself because one doesn't think of Jack the Ripper as having a bedroom. A bedroom is a quiet, domestic sanctum. And to link those words, Jack the Ripper, with bedroom, it seems such an extraordinary and brutal juxtaposition, really.
What you begin to get in this Ripper case are layers of evidence that all point or are consistent with Walter Sickert. Then you get circumstantial evidence, all consistent with Walter Sickert, Jack the Ripper. You get his own antics. You get layer after layer after layer, and you start saying, how can this be anything but? Because if this is a coincidence, it's the most incredible coincidence I've ever seen in my life. My heart is beating fast. I'm telling you one thing, I think you're gonna have to have a very special display for this thing, or someone's gonna tear it off the wall. You're gonna be so excited by it.
Now I'll reveal the painting.
It's making my hand shake. Huh.
Is this how you expected the painting to be?
I expected it would be something that would be totally baffling, which it is. I expected it to be dark, and it's creepy. I mean, it's not...
Well, it's a dark, mysterious picture, isn't it?
And very mysterious.
But what I see standing back here is a figure who has her legs, or
I see what you're saying.
See, there's one foot on the ground there, and then you can see the knee coming out from here, and her foot is slightly pointed.
Yeah.
And I would say it's female simply because of the silhouette that it makes against the light. He's certainly being provocative, we know that. He's using the title. He's using it in a very provocative manner.
It could be more that the title is symbolic of some part of him.
Yes, I think what it's doing is naming the bedroom as having some connection with Jack the Ripper. He may be saying that he is Jack the Ripper and that it is his bedroom.
It's also, 1908 is a year after the Camden Town murder, which I believe he committed in 1907. So this might be in the Camden Town area, but who knows?
It was painted in Mornington Crescent.
Mornington Crescent, well, that's where he lived.
Oh, well, in that case, it is Mornington Crescent.
That's even worse.
Those are houses, Georgian houses with...
Well, if that's Mornington Crescent and that's where he lives and it's Jack the Ripper's bedroom, again, that's part of the tease, because that was his house.
Yes.
You know, if I painted my bedroom in my house and called it Jack the Ripper's bedroom, then you should really worry about me. I'm absolutely positively sure that Walter Richard Sickert was Jack the Ripper. If I were not 100% sure, I would not have pursued this case to its bitter end. But I believe that it's important to see how far we can go with evidence this old. It isn't even about identifying the killer as Walter Sickert anymore. To me, it is a given that he is Jack the Ripper. But what I think is important now is what can we learn from this man that might teach us more about psychopaths? That's what matters.
Out there is an element who is going to believe this nonsense that Sickert was the Ripper. Some lunatic will go in the Tate or somewhere else and slash a canvas because he was Jack the Ripper. This is the sort of thing, this is the sort of nonsense which actually triggers this behaviour. And there is this element out there who will believe it.
If I were wrong about Walter Sickert, I want to know that. Even after $6 million and 13 months of working myself to death, because I would never, ever want to accuse somebody of any crime, much less serial murders and dismemberments. And if I found evidence right now that completely exonerated Walter Sickert, I would have to accept it, I would admit it, I would go back to being a waitress. Because my career would probably be over with.
I'm pretty convinced so far. Most homicides that are put together really sweetly, that come together nicely, are not a smoking gun. What they are is a collection of innumerable pieces of a puzzle that you put together. No one thing by itself being enough of a connection to say absolutely that John Brown did it, but you spin a web of statistical possibilities that you were driven to the conclusion that A must have done it.
Well, I think Sickert would very definitely have a lot of explaining to do in court. I think Patricia has marshaled a stunning amount of information. We'd certainly bring him in as a suspect, and I think I could certainly present a case to a grand jury and get an indictment to take him to trial.
as a novelist, she has used that obsessional sense of the Ripper's life and Sickert's life and woven a psychological portrait of Sickert, which is fascinating, almost brilliant and Dickensian, but to me a work of fiction, not a fact.
You know, she very well may be right. I can't prove she's wrong. And unfortunately, I can't prove absolutely she's right. But considering what we're doing in terms of looking at a case that's 114 years old, I haven't seen a better theory.
I do not want to live with this any longer. It is not a joy, it is not a pleasure. It's necessary. I'm very proud of what the team has done, of everybody who has helped in this, but I'm going to go back to my own life now.